Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. In today's video, we are going to be investigating a booktube book talk mystery. Who is the real author of Corinne by Rebecca Morrow? Is it perhaps Stephenie Meyer, as some people think, or is it somebody else? I am not the first person to talk about this, and I am partly reading this as a collab. I'm going to be joining a live show over on Mara from Books Like Woe's channel, which I will link up above if you want to go and follow that, where me and her and some other great booktubers are all reading this book, Corinne, and getting together to discuss, do we think this is by Stephenie Meyer? Who do we think it's by? What did we think of the book? So you can join us live. But I thought it would be fun to do a reading vlog as I'm picking up this book. So if you're not familiar with it, Corinne is a book written under a pseudonym by a best-selling author, and people have been speculating about who the author's identity really might be. Some people were speculating it might be Stephenie Meyer of the Twilight books. I have heard some people say they think it might be Shannon Hale, who's written quite a few books that you might know. I'll pop a few up on the screen here. I don't know. I'm curious to read it for myself. I've also heard that it's quite a good book. It's an adult fiction novel with a romantic subplot that is about somebody coming out of a religious background that is like kind of culty, feels vaguely Mormon or evangelical. I don't know. I've heard people talk about it and it seems like something that would be up my alley, and I'm very curious to find out what I think about it. I have read quite a number of books by Stephenie Meyer, so I feel like I might have a good sense of whether this is her writing style. I've also read quite a few books by Shannon Hale, so if that's who it is, maybe I can figure it out. I don't know. So come along with me. I'm going to be reading Corinne in the next couple of days, and we'll see. I'll talk about the book, talk about my thoughts, and talk about if I have any ideas about who the mysterious author might be. But first I have to go pick up a copy. I ordered a copy for pickup at Barnes & Noble, so I'm going to be heading to my favorite Barnes & Noble in New York City to pick it up, and you know, maybe I'll browse a little bit too, so come along with me. I'm here with my first update, thoughts on Corinne. I'm getting through it pretty quickly. I'm about 150 pages into the book so far. And okay, first of all, I will say this. I have to agree with other people who've said they don't think it's Stephenie Meyer. I also don't think it's Stephenie Meyer. I don't think Stephenie Meyer can write this well. And not that to say that this is like super fancy writing or flowery or literary. It's not like the best writing that I've ever read, but it's reasonably good. I do think, to me, it reads more like Shannon Hale. I would not be shocked if this was Shannon Hale. I know she does have some kind of a religious background. I see why people might guess Stephenie Meyer just because that would be some tea. This is clearly written by somebody who grew up in a very conservative church. And the early part of the book following Corinne as a teenager is set in, I would say, the 80s probably is kind of how it reads. Maybe the early 90s, maybe the 90s, maybe the early 90s, but it doesn't get specific about the Christian denomination or faith. There is one reference to somebody looking evangelical, so it could be a more conservative version of evangelicalism. I could also see this being similar to Mormonism. There are some specifics about the language that's used that reminds me of that, but it doesn't have to be. Either way, you can tell that whoever wrote this, it's lived experience, just because there are so many small details that feel accurate. And this is a church that is more conservative than the ones that I grew up in. There's a lot more gender specific rules and different things that I didn't necessarily grow up with. I had my own baggage to unpack with it. But yeah, it's really interesting. I am liking it pretty well. There are times that it's a little bit dull, but I also understand why those things are in there. I think it's trying to build up what's happening between characters as we reach different turning points. I don't know. I would say that that I could see this being Shannon Hale. I think the writing is a bit reminiscent of her writing style. I wouldn't say I know for sure this is definitely who it's by, but I think it's certainly within the realm of possibility. I would be shocked if this was by Stephenie Meyer. It doesn't read to me like her writing, but who knows? I mean, I guess it's possible. I'm super curious to see what everybody else thinks when we do our live stream, to be honest, and whether people agree with me. I think the writing is simple. It's not complex or flowery at all. At times, a little even more simple than what I prefer my writing to be, but I think it's serviceable, reasonably easy to read, and it doesn't have some of the oddities that you would find in Stephenie Meyer's writing, which is why I suspect it's not by her. So at the beginning of the story, Corinne is a teenage girl growing up in a fundamentalist family, but sort of on the outskirts. She describes herself as fat and having acne and wearing these large shapeless clothes that are modest but not pretty, and she's not really pretty. And you know, you feel like she's kind of fading into the background. And it's the kind of church too where college isn't explicitly forbidden, but it's definitely discouraged and not seen as a godly thing to do. I'm so curious, to be honest, who this is and what their religious background is. It could be Mormon, but it also could be some of the more fundamentalist Christian evangelical organizations. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. But the fact that they use the words bishops and elders for all of the men is interesting. But there are other denominations that do that, so I don't know. I don't know that I could specifically pinpoint what it's supposed to be. Anyway, but it follows this girl. Her mom kind of came to religion later in life. The dad kind of abandons them. They can't pay rent, so they end up moving into the basement of her mom's friend's house. And the friend has a son around the same age as Corinne, and they slowly become friends and start developing this forbidden relationship, right, as teenagers. And that is the early part of the book. Of course everything blows up, and so we jump ahead many years to like the early 2000s, where she's now an adult, has built a life for herself, but is back to help take care of her mom, and is reconnecting with this now divorced man who is still in the fundamentalist church that she left. And that makes for some really complicated interactions between the two of them. It's I'll be honest, it's a little disturbing for me to read some of the stuff about modesty and purity and male-female dynamics, even though this isn't exactly the same as the kind of thing that I grew up with. It just reminds me a lot of things that I grew up with, and it's kind of weird to me that she is still into him this much further in her life. I know he was important for her as a teenager, but girl, you've moved on. Like, really, this is still the person? I don't know. I don't know how this book is gonna end. Part of me sort of hopes they don't end up together unless he changes a lot. I don't know, but it's saying it's like a modern day Romeo and Juliet is what Jodi Picoult says. So we'll see. I don't know how I feel about that, because he's still very much in the clutches of this fundamentalist church and feels guilty for his sin. And yeah, I don't know. It's there's so many small details about things like, oh, when did you start listening to secular music? And people who didn't grow up in the church might not even know what the word secular means in this context. It's not specifically Christian music that is for a general audience, music of the world in a negative sense. This has a lot of Christian lingo in it. And I think it reminds me of how a lot of these religious organizations can be so high control in the way that they micromanage every element of your life, and even more so for women, your behavior, the way you dress, the media you consume, and the way that they guilt you into things and gaslight you into thinking that you're wrong and not trusting your own emotions. There's an example of her being afraid to admit that she's seen the Star Wars movies, which aren't explicitly forbidden. It's supposed to be like, well, what is your conscience telling you? Which I definitely grew up with that kind of rhetoric, I'll tell you. Like, well, what is your conscience telling you? And yet saying that if you push back on your conscience too much, it can ruin it, and then you can think it's okay when really it's not okay. I don't know. It's very, very much giving high control, gaslighting, make you afraid to trust your own instincts and trust your own gut reaction of what is and isn't okay for you. Like, is this triggering? Slightly, maybe. Yeah. Anyway, I think it's a good novel, and it is an interesting mystery as to who wrote it. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's probably not Stephenie Meyer. I'm so curious who it is, because it says Rebecca Morrow is a pseudonym for a New York Times bestselling author. Clearly somebody with a religious background who doesn't want it to be super obvious that she wrote a novel about somebody essentially deconstructing from fundamentalist Christianity, because that's what this book is about. So, all right, I will check back in once I've read some more. Good morning. I am about 300 pages of the way into Corinne. I expect to finish it pretty easily today. And I want to talk some more about it because I'm curious. I had a moment where I was like, maybe this could be Stephenie Meyer, because Stephenie Meyer does this weird thing of repeating words over and over again. Like in Twilight, it's the word pomegranate. Like, okay, we get it that this is like a Hades and Persephone deal. Pomegranate, pomegranate, pomegranate. In this book, the number of times it says the love interest's name, Enoch, is a lot. Like, sometimes it'll say it like 3 times in a row, and it just Enoch, 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 Enoch. It's never like, it's almost, it almost never uses like his pronouns. It uses his name so much, to the point where honestly I find it to be a little bit irritating. It's not like something something Enoch, I went into his kitchen. It's like, I went into Enoch's kitchen. I don't know. Maybe this doesn't bother other people, but there is a lot of repetitiveness, especially of the name. Stephenie Meyer does do stuff like that. So could it be Stephenie Meyer? Maybe. Also, the other thing I've noticed is it's using the word imprinted on. Where do we know that from? Oh yeah, the Twilight series. However, I'm skeptical that it's Stephenie Meyer. I think the likelihood of it being somebody like Shannon Hale, and it may not be either of these people, like, let's be real. There's probably authors that are bestsellers that I'm just not super aware of who are formerly religious. I did a little bit of digging, which was interesting, and Shannon Hale is a former Mormon. She's no longer part of the church. So might it make sense for her to write an adult novel about somebody deconstructing from a somewhat similar background? Maybe. It would also make sense because she primarily is writing books for children now. Something like this, with the kind of explicit sexuality it has, you can understand why, if it was her, she might want to separate herself a little bit from the name that she publishes her children's books under. That might make sense. I've got to say, we did have a sex scene with oral between the characters, and it was deeply uncomfortable to read. It was not, I mean, I guess the positive is you could say, well, it's just not romanticizing anything, which, yeah, but it's also, I don't know, it was kind of gross. Like, the way it was written, I was like, oh, okay. Which some people are probably gonna find fine and be kind of into, but I was slightly grossed out by the descriptive choices made in the depiction of that scene. Like, it kind of icked me out a little bit. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of how Joe Abercrombie writes sex scenes. If you've read the first Law series, he writes sex scenes that are not sexy. I mean, they're realistic, I guess. Yeah, sex sometimes is kind of weird and messy and whatever. But the way he writes them and the descriptive word choices used is just not sexy. And this felt very similar to me, which I think is maybe not the intent, because I feel like we're supposed to be rooting for this couple. I feel like it's supposed to be kind of a romance, and I don't know. As somebody who's a big romance reader, it was just a little odd to me, I guess. What else do I want to say about this? Listen, all of what I'm going to say is purely speculation, because who really knows? I'm curious, right? Because let's just say that the characters in this book are stand-ins to a certain extent, semi-fictionalized stand-ins for real-life people, right? And that may not be the case. It may be that these characters are dramatically different from whoever the author is. But just out of curiosity, I was like, let me find some pictures of these two authors with their husbands, because the characters in this book are described in very specific ways, which is interesting. Corinne is described as being fat, she is plus size, and plain, not particularly pretty. Enoch is like a big burly dude. He's tall and large and has like a big chest and belly and stuff like that. Now it's interesting, right? This is like purely speculation for fun. It may not matter. These may be purely fictionalized. But here is Stephenie Meyer and her husband, who is definitely not big and tall and burly. However, she is quite curvaceous. So who knows? Here is Shannon Hale and her husband Dean Hale. He's kind of a big burly dude. She's very mid-size. But are there mid-sized people who see themselves as larger than they are? Sure. Also, could it not be a known voices thing for fatness? Sure. Could this all be entirely fictionalized? Yeah. Maybe it's somebody entirely different that is neither of these people, that is just not on my radar, and, it's all wrong. I just find it interesting, since that's what we're talking about here. Why not do some research and speculate? What do I think at this point? I feel like it could be Shannon Hale. It could be Stephenie Meyer, although I do think if it is her, this is a bit of a step up from her normal writing. It's not great writing though. Like I said, it is very repetitive and makes some interesting choices. I don't know. I find the topics that this is covering really interesting. I'm curious to see where the ending of the book is gonna go, but I can't say at this point that I'm really rooting for this couple to be together. I'm kind of like, really? Why is this the best thing? But this will give you a lot of insight into what it's like to be in a high control religious environment. So anyway, that's where we're at with Corinne. I'm gonna go finish this book, put on some makeup, and get myself together for the day, and then I will come back to wrap this up and we'll discuss, see if I come away with anything else. Also though, if you're watching this and you have a thought of who the author could be, leave it in the comments down below. Like a New York Times bestseller who has come from a high control religious group. If you have thoughts, let me know, because I'm curious. All right, I finished reading Corinne, and I want to talk about the end of it. This was interesting. There are some things that I really like about it in terms of how this kind of religious upbringing and teachings about guilt and shame are talked about in the context of sex and how it impacts people's understanding of sex and their sex lives. Enoch's ex-wife had figured out in their marriage that she was gay, and she talked about how it took her a long time to figure that out because she was never taught that women were supposed to enjoy sex, that you're just supposed to sort of lay there. And Enoch was never taught that women were supposed to enjoy sex. So obviously kind of horrifying, but because of that, it took her a long time to figure it out. He didn't know any better. And we see how Enoch and Corinne as they're beginning a sexual relationship with each other, are having to work through some of their issues with shame and the past and discomfort with names for certain things or whatever. And that I think is really interesting, and I think accurately a problem for a lot of people with this kind of upbringing. So I like how it's talking about some of those things. There's a lot of sex in the back half of this book. Like the last third of it, there's a lot of sex scenes, including one while she's on her period, which I'm like, okay, like I get that the idea of this was that like, oh, we can just break through taboos now and whatever. But I was like, okay, I don't know. I don't need that specifically. Otherwise, I feel like a lot of the descriptive approach to most of the other sex scenes was much better than that first one that kind of grossed me out a little bit, but it was fine. It is a real issue though of people struggling to fully be in the moment and connect to their bodies when they're raised in sort of intense versions of purity culture and being taught that, like, I wasn't taught that women shouldn't enjoy sex, but I was taught this idea that sort of your body doesn't belong to you, it belongs to your husband, and you need to kind of be available to meet each other's needs sort of thing, which I'm now unpacking as being highly questionable and easily leading to encounters with less than enthusiastic consent. And I think it's complicated when we're talking about these sorts of scenarios, but it is a real problem. The other thing that I did like about this and the way that it handled sex is it talks fairly realistically about how there are some women who don't just orgasm super easily with penetration, and they have a conversation about that. They have conversations about abortion and contraception, these things that are hot button issues within church that are important to discuss. And it is kind of funny how it like interrupts them in the middle of a moment they're having together, but that those things are necessary to talk about. The other thing that gets at, which is interesting, is that there's this idea, I think sometimes in these communities, that if you're worldly or you're not in the church or whatever, that people are just out there partying all the time and having tons of sex all the time. It's like this debauched, like debauchery with abandon kind of scenario. And, you know, for some people maybe that is, and whatever, that's fine, but there are plenty of people where that's not the case. That's not even the reason that they're leaving the church for many people. And that is certainly addressed here, where Corinne's like, yeah, no, I think I went to one party. I don't drink. I don't smoke. You're the third man I've slept with. And that's not to say it would be a problem if she did decide to go out and do all of those things, but I think it's to put in perspective the fact that there are plenty of people who might leave a religion or leave a faith, not because they just want free license to go out and do whatever they want to do, but because of other reasons. So I like how it's kind of trying to explore that a bit. Ultimately, I'm okay with her and Enoch ending up together. I'm still really annoyed at how often Enoch, his name, is in this book, because it's so many times, like over and over and over again. The repetitiveness of the writing is a lot. Like, this book could probably be significantly shorter just if we used more pronouns. Yeah, I'm not mad that I read this. I wouldn't say that it's a new favorite for me or anything. The writing itself is not my favorite. I don't really care that much for the romance in particular. I find this more interesting as a book that is discussing high control religions and the impact that they have, but through a novel. And I think it's interesting to explore this question of who the author might be, because there's like a mystery around it. I would probably give this like a 3-star rating. I liked it. I didn't love it. I'm not mad that I read it though, and I do think it's going to be an interesting conversation to have with all of the other people reading it as to who we think the author might be and why. I'm not sure what I think. I think there could be a really strong case made for it being Shannon Hale, but who knows? Talk to me in the comments down below again, though, if you have predictions or ideas of who it could be, because I am curious. It's an interesting novel, and this was an interesting project. I think that's the majority of my thoughts on this, so I'll end it here, but tune in to Mara's channel to hear a full discussion. Who all is going to be in that? I know it's me, Mara, I'll tell you, hold on. It's a good group, honestly. It's gonna be fun. Okay, so it's me, Mara from Books Like Whoa. It's gonna be over on her channel. Ashley from Bookish Realm reads with Rachel, and my name is Marinez, which it's gonna be a fun time, y'all, with all of us. So tune in. It's gonna be an epic live show. Those are my thoughts on Corinne. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know your thoughts. Have you read this? What do you think? Who do you think the author is? What did you think of the themes? I'd love to hear from you. If you like this video, it always helps if you give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.